Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Global Competition Project's event on education, 20-somethings, and competition. I'm Dr. Tim Welter, a senior research fellow here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and I'm excited for this event today, and thank you for joining us for this fourth public event of the Institute's Global Competition Project. This is an offshoot, actually, of a discussion we had during the first event, just trying to understand what competition is exactly and how we might attack the challenge that we're faced with as a country today and on the global landscape. We also have taken a look at global supply chains using microelectronics as a case study. And then our most recent event before today, we took a look at strategic communications and what that means for our competitive advantage as a country. So today's event is focused on education as a competitive advantage for the United States. What that means for our universities, our workforce, our society, and how young Americans view and might prepare for the dynamics of the global landscape that is emerging before our eyes today. The United States is often recognized as having the world's best education system. People come here from all over the world to study and learn, as we know. However, while the U.S. might have the best education system on the planet, American students are falling behind in some of the basics in science, math, and reading. If you look at the surveys, depending on the year and which survey, students in the United States are falling behind or fall somewhere between the 15th and 40th in the world compared to students in other nations on those subjects in science, math, and reading. So why and how is this the case? If our education system is truly the world's envy, and people want to come here and study. Perhaps more importantly, how does that translate to our nation's ability to compete and thrive on the world stage in the future? The resilience of and efficacy of a nation's education system directly impact that nation's ability to compete on the global stage over time, with each generation building on the success of those preceding. At least that's the case for the United States. While the United States' ascent as a modern global superpower was due in part to its post-World War II posture among the parade of nations, it was also heavily reliant on its endless investment in and pursuit of knowledge. That knowledge was then translated into advances and advantages in research and technology, among a myriad other areas, lending to our growth, security, and prosperity. The geopolitical and economic landscape, though, has shifted here in the 21st century. Students from what have been described as peer competitor nations are now surpassing young Americans across the education spectrum in certain cases. So what does this say? What does this trend say about the prospects of American leadership and prosperity in the future? How's it going to look? Also to consider, in contrast to America's earliest days, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2020, less than 2% of Americans worked in agriculture. About 13% worked in manufacturing, and the remainder, the vast majority of Americans, worked in service-providing industries. A trend probably not going to reverse anytime soon, unlikely to reverse anytime soon. So to remain competitive to that end, the U.S. must be equipped to educate and train its population accordingly. That includes prioritizing science and technology, engineering and math as a vital part of the equation for success based on where we've been in the past. So how can policymakers, among with business leaders and academia, assure that focus and leverage, and so we can leverage nascent talent to posture the U.S. for enduring competitive advantage? Tomorrow's generation will have to grapple with the implications of education policies and decisions in place by today's generation of leaders. So how can we best bridge that gap while inspiring ingenuity, creativity, the entrepreneurial spirit, elements vital to America's historical success and prosperity as a nation? Furthermore, how have views of free enterprise and entrepreneurism evolved in our society, especially in institutes of higher learning? This is something that continuously comes up in discussion today. How does that translate to our competitive stance in science and technology and research and development, and how younger people view our role in the world? Accordingly, what can we do about it, given heavy influences by China, especially on important STEM campuses across the country? And hoping we'll hear some of that today from our panelists. Ultimately, what are the risks and opportunities that we have here as a country, the United States, with regard to our core institutions, our security and prosperity? So this is why we're here today, to examine those kinds of questions. But before we get into today's discussion, I'd like to offer the floor to the chairman of the Potomac Institute, General Al Gray, for his remarks.
No, I just want to welcome our distinguished visitors today. We really, here at Potomac Institute, we deeply appreciate you taking the time to work with us. This is a very critical topic, really, the whole information age and the things that we have to know about it and how we're going to operate in the future with respect to our national security. So with that, let's get on with it and
All righty, sir.
give the time to the people who really know what they're talking about.
Yes, sir. Sounds good. So without further ado, we'll I invite our CEO for the Potomac Institute, Dr. Jen Buss, for some remarks also.
Thanks, Tim. Make sure I don't trip on wires. Thank you, everyone, for coming to virtually and in person today to join us and talk about what the future of America looks like and how we will compete. To build on some of the comments that Tim made regarding what is our competitive advantage as it relates to education, some of the things that we want to keep in mind is, as Tim had also said this, in the rising costs of college education and how that impacts the 20-somethings today and of the future. Being able to critically think about the problems that we're faced with and not just rote memorization of facts and figures. And especially in STEM education, what do we need here in the country to support the technologies or support where we want technology to go? And how do we make sure that we have the human capital to address that? So I'm sure that our panelists today will do a fantastic job addressing at least each of those, if not a whole myriad more of topics today. So over to you.
Thank you. So before we introduce our panel members, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Global Competition Project to bring some context to what we're doing here. I talked about it a little bit earlier, but the project was launched to explore what the United States must do to continue to thrive as a global leader, economically and otherwise, driving toward a societal level understanding and approach to competition at the intersection of policy, industry, and science and technology. So to do so, the project is commissioning a spectrum of experts, which we have included today on our panel, from diverse fields across the Potomac Institute's network. And their purpose is to highlight and elevate issues surrounding both the challenges and opportunities associated with societal level competition today and in the future. So again, what are the greatest vulnerabilities to consider? What is at stake, and how do we best leverage our strengths as a country to that end? Ultimately, the project's goal is to develop foundational references through research, discussion, events and papers, etc., for national security professionals, for policymakers, industry leaders, and others that are involved in this community as they drive awareness and understanding in how the U.S. might address the most consequential aspects of near-peer competition. So that said, I'm going to continue with introducing our distinguished panel. First, I'd like to, I'm very happy to introduce the Honorable Al Shaffer, who's here to my left, former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and a member of the Potomac Institute's Board of Regents. Prior to working at ANS, he served as Director, NATO Collaboration Support Office, in addition to a variety of other very distinguished roles across the Department of Defense, all after retiring from the Air Force as a full colonel and 24 years in uniform. And I just want to, so Secretary Shaffer is going to moderate our discussion today on education as a competitive advantage for the United States. I also wanted to thank him personally and publicly for his leadership and involvement in several of our global competition project events, going back to the project start. His active support and participation has lent greatly to the project's success to date. From the outset, he's set a high bar on who he's been able to invite and bring into the to participate in the events, and that's translated to some very thoughtful discussions, very substantive discussions as we explore the topics that we've tackled. So thank you, sir, for that. Speaking of those experts that we have here today, Al is joined by our distinguished panelists, whom I'm also very pleased to introduce, starting with in California, Dr. Patricia Falcone, who's the Deputy Director for Science and Technology at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Dr. Falcone oversees the strategic development of the lab's capabilities and is responsible for its collaborative research with academia and the private sector, as well as its internal investment portfolio. Prior to the lab, Dr. Falcone was with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where she served as Associate Director for National Security and International Affairs. Next, also we from MIT, we have Professor Daniel Hastings, who's the head of the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. He's been there serving in a variety of faculty and leadership positions since 1985. And across his distinguished career, he's also served in government, serving as the chief scientist for the United States Air Force. He was also on the chair of he was also the chair of the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board and served on the Aerospace Board of Trustees for over 18 years, among his other distinguished career roles. We also have Ms. Joy Schanenberger, founder and CEO of Boone Group, a firm focused on technologies within the national security, energy, and infrastructure markets. Joy is a specialist in defense acquisitions and cybersecurity and has worked in a variety of roles in government and the private sector. Most recently, prior to Boone Group, she served as a senior strategist in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and also served as the primary speechwriter for the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Very happy to have her with us today. Last but definitely not least, to my right here, we have Mr. Trevor Hufford, who's a research assistant at the Potomac Institute here, where he also runs the Science and Technology Policy Intern Program. That program has a long-running history of hosting top-notch university students with a variety of academic backgrounds related to the Institute's mission, intersecting science, technology, national security, and business. So, with that said, Secretary Shaffer will start by providing a deeper introduction of the issue and a framework for our discussion that will ultimately be captured along with highlights from today's event in a paper, one in a series of papers to be produced for the project. So ultimately the goal for those papers, along with the substance of today's event, is hopefully will be drawn upon, again, as a reference for policymakers, industry leaders, and others, and how the country might address the most consequential aspects of societal level competition in the future. So over to you, sir.
Tim, thank you very much. And terrific introduction. I will thank you. I will also point out one thing. It is the Honorable Dr. Pat Falcone.
Oh,
because she was Senate confirmed, so
yes, sir.
That's always an important distinction. I want to thank the
apologies.
No apologies. It's something to be pointed out. I want to thank the panelists for agreeing to speak. I also want to put a little bit of a context around it, and you've hit much of it already, Tim. But I want to quote from Diane Souvain, the chair of the National Science Board, and something that she said before a hearing of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology in January 2020. She said, and I quote, this was the beginning of her testimony, "Since World War II, advancements in science and technology have driven much of our economic growth, underpinned our national security, and transformed nearly every aspect of Americans' daily lives. New technologies built on federally funded discovery research have led to new businesses, revolutionized healthcare, and created the mobile digital world. Our preeminence has not happened by chance. Sustained bipartisan commitment to investing in basic research has played a key role in establishing and maintaining our knowledge ecosystem and the innovation-driving partnership among academia, government, and the private sector. As we think about what our country needs to compete in the 21st century global economy, we must renew our commitment to strengthen this key component of our national infrastructure and ensure that we are not technologically surprised in critical technologies like quantum computing and artificial intelligence. Collectively, we must do this because the world has changed and our country has changed. And while science is the endless frontier, we are not the only explorers." I thought that was a very, very good and powerful statement that Diane made. And I will also point out that it strikes at what we're talking about today. The underpinning of the U.S. technological ability to compete is our people, and it's our education, and how well we educate young people and bring non-domestically produced young people into America and American businesses. But I will tell you I'm concerned. I will tell you I'm concerned, and Tim talked about this a little bit, because I looked at the Office of Economic Cooperation and Development, and each year they publish a performance in international science and ability. And I just picked out 6 countries: China, Canada, Poland, Estonia, Germany, and the United States. In reading, science, and math, the U.S. was last in that group of 6 countries on 2 of the categories and 5th in the other. The U.S. is falling way behind countries like China, Estonia, Poland, Canada, in the performance in science, math, and reading by our 15-year-olds. If you don't have the ability at 15, it's going to be very hard to be competitive in undergraduate, master's, and doctorate. And we're seeing some of that with the number of non-U.S. people employed in technical industries and business. In engineering and computer science, according to the National Science Foundation, between 40 and 60% of all workers with masters and PhDs in computer science, in artificial intelligence, and in engineering are not domestically produced people. They might have come here to go to university, some stay, some don't. The point is, we no longer produce scientists and engineers that are competitive in this global market. So why are we talking about the 20-somethings? I was very lucky. I came of age in an era, basically just coming out of the World War II, where we had 70% of the R&D investment in the world from the United States, and most of that investment was federal funding. As we have gone forward, the U.S. still has the greatest total investment in R&D, but other countries have seen how important it is. And the amount and the percentage of global R&D funded by the United States is very small. It's down around 15%. But what is telling is over the last 50 years, most of the R&D investment by America is now coming from industry, not federal sources. So we're no longer really trying to create new knowledge. Industry is trying to get product. Product's important, but you still have to prime the pump. And when I think of what came out of the golden age of science, the transistor invented at Bell Laboratories. Think of the advances in aviation with some of the aviation companies in America. Think of President Kennedy saying, we will have a man on the moon in this decade. That spurred an enormous amount of science, scientific achievement, and we did it. So what is the American strategy today for technology development? I honestly don't know that we have one. I do know that China has one and published their 14th five-year plan last March. Embedded in that, President Xi said that China will be the dominant player in technologies like AI, and they are funding it, and they are developing and going after it. So we still have a very good infrastructure in America, but China wants to compete in the technological space, and they're going about it in a very smart way. So I think we need to think about it. And I came across another writing in December 2021 from Graham Allison at Harvard's Belfer Center, The Great Tech Rivalry, China versus the United States. And he talked about in that report, was fascinating, how 20 years earlier, Belfer had commissioned another report that was optimistic that the U.S. would retain world leadership in technology development, and then went on to say that it did not look like China had the resources to be competitive in technology. We were wrong. And we are now in a competition with a nation that has more people, will soon have a larger GDP, and produces about 3 to 4 times the number of scientists and engineers and mathematicians as are produced in the United States. We don't have the luxury of presuming that because we are in Fortress America, we will be the technological leader. If we don't do something, and that starts with educating 20-somethings, if we don't do something different, I'm afraid that we are going to have a hard time competing. And we have been talking about STEM and the importance of STEM for at least the last 15 or 20 years, and yet we're not seeing results. I don't know why. There are a number of reasons, and I'm really looking forward to some of the younger people giving their impression of STEM. But I would like us to get to a couple of questions. And not all of this globalization is bad. In fact, I think globalization of technology is good, as long as it's done fairly and equitably. The questions I would like to answer is, in what ways do globalization of technology affect U.S. national security, both positively and negatively? Should the United States, and more broadly the United States and our allies, be concerned about technological competition or embrace it? What are concrete steps that the United States could take to increase the performance of Americans and people working in America of math, science, and reading compared to other nations? How do we stop being somewhere between 15th and 40th? And most importantly, I think, are there other models, organization, funding, pathways that could increase the competitive stature of the United States for the next 20 to 30 years in technology? Is the current university model that we have of block learning sufficient going into the future, or do we need to evolve to a model of continuous learning? And I will leave with this thought. When I was in the Pentagon, I would ask our acquisition people if they were professional. And of course, our acquisition professionals all said, yes, we're professional. My response to them, and PEOs and program managers, is they want to be professional. To me, professional professions are those that do continuous learning with tested results every year. And I think back to someone that Ms. Shannenberger and I used to work for, Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall, I would go in to see him in the middle of the day, and he would from time to time be taking online law courses to maintain his law degree. He had to test every year. We have shifted the model for training acquisition professionals in the DoD to continuous learning, where they have to take modules that are testable each year in things that matter. So I will pose to the rest of the panel, do we have the model for education right, or do we have to make some changes? And I think with that, it's a good time to hear from the people who are much smarter than I am.
All righty. Dr. Falcone, we're going to start with you. You're welcome to go ahead and start when you're ready.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Al, and thank you to the Potomac Institute for inviting me to be a part of this important discussion. I was going to begin by talking a little bit about my vantage point to look at these issues. I have the privilege of working at one of our national laboratories whose work is focused on national security. We're a science and technology laboratory of about 8,000 people with a budget of about $2.8 billion. We're located in Northern California within driving distance of Silicon Valley and its great companies and heritage of innovation. We are hiring. Almost half our staff have joined the lab within the past 5 years. They're not all in their 20s, those new hires, but more than half our folks are scientists and engineers, and they are well prepared. We currently have our largest postdoctoral cohort ever, about 300 postdocs. But we do have challenges in the workplace, just to have some, and about the career decisions and decision-making processes by our folks. It's expensive to live here. Traffic is bad. COVID is really disorienting. We have hundreds of employees who have never been on our site at all. Our population does not look like the citizens who pay for us. And our culture, in which a brisk competition of ideas doesn't always feel welcoming or safe to bring their whole selves. As I already mentioned, we have lots of competition within driving distance. So as folks are thinking about their careers, they have lots of options without having to change their house, if they manage to afford a house, that is. And it is true that visions of careers are changing and these career expectations are changing. There's an impatience with slow processes, with old views of doing your time. But COVID has taught us a lot about flexibility, about remote work, even in an environment where a lot of experimental work and of course classified work requires an on-site presence. So to get at some of Al's questions, I do concur with him that we have to work more on and develop and implement new practices to really face the reality of globalization on both our science and technology enterprise, but really the US and our allies' national security. And implicit in that, of course, is how we acquire, educate, and nurture the workers as the enterprise is evolving kind of all by itself. So attracting and educating these workers of high quality now and into the future gets to those questions Al had about increasing the performance of our educational system by way of effectively preparing our citizens to prosper in this new world. I think it's important just to, I am, of course, I'm a big fan of STEM. I think, more than half of our folks in our 8,000 employees are scientists and engineers. But I think it's important to say that we've got to be sure that all of our citizens have got excellent training with both fluency, literacy, and numeracy. It matters for our democracy. It matters that our citizens can all have good jobs in a global economy. And of course, it matters that we get some professional scientists and engineers out of the whole process. Al's already talked about how globalization and the changing fraction of government funding in the overall mix of US research and development is a characteristic of our current times. And what that means is that our model for doing national security science and technology is just quite different. And we need to do a better job of acknowledging that and reshaping the enterprise and our approaches, our work approaches. And the key point is partnerships. We do not own the technical edge of most technical areas inside the national security community. And so the technical edge is generally in the private sector, in non-governmental organizations, and of course, internationally. So our enterprise has to be much more porous, and our models for careers have to be more open. In addition, we are talking about competition. And so there has to be some different approaches and more thoughtfulness about information management and about transition of inventions. But I think there's, great opportunities for careers with varied opportunities, but within national security, we'd like to have that be more open so that in fact, we don't have a lot of people coming in and out of our community. That's not very helpful for information management. And relative to international engagement, I think we need much more purposeful engagement with allies and what I would call witting engagement with non-allies. So then going, from our employees to how we get there, we do know something about improving education, I think, particularly in science, math, and engineering. But first, and I guess I just want to highlight it, I don't have concrete recommendations here, and I'm guessing your project will need lots more workshops, but we do need to build healthy communities throughout our country. We cannot have areas where folks are neglected, where even the basics aren't there. So we've got to honor education and educators, and our government processes have to permit tailored solutions in communities to foster competition and be open to new ideas and different ways of doing it when grounded in values. With respect to STEM education, I'll defer to Professor Hastings, who of course has spent a career on this, but I do want to say that we do know things about education and what it takes to attract more. We have more knowledge of the brain, how we learn things, and about how important it is in STEM to think about the brain as a muscle and not just like something that some people get math and some people don't. That really it takes like practicing for a sport. We're all aware of these 10,000 hours of continuous of training, right at that expert, non-expert edge, how important that is. So we need to make sure that we're communicating that to students. And we need to have teaching informed by new approaches. I think some notable learnings on that I would highlight is how the computer science courses were restructured at Harvey Mudd, which included both teaching the faculty members how to respond to folks in class that might get things off course, but even more might make other students in the class find taking computer science off-putting as new. So they have really improved over the last decade, the taking of these classes and the accomplishment in the classes by all students, women, minorities. I think we've got to embrace curiosity. I think we can't let groups of our citizens say that they don't need to take math because they don't need math later on. We need to have all of our students taking math and some computer science as a part of K through 12 education. In college, we know that if we could keep all of the students that say they want to major in science and engineering when they start college, if we kept them in STEM, that we would do a lot better at having our STEM employees look more like the taxpayers who pay at least my salary. And so, a lot of pedagogic ideas we know matter: the flipped classroom, peer instruction, And I'll note research experiences really do matter. And so to really envision what I've mentioned, I have one slide that I'd like to introduce to see about a paradigm shift, and maybe Catherine can help me get that up now.
She has a panic look on her
Sure.
face.
I do not, I promise.
All right, so this is a slide from a paper that was published in EOS less than a year ago, last April. And so EOS is a journal of the American Geophysical Union. And so of course, that's where the earth scientist professional. And they brought the concept for both STEM education and STEM careers of a braided river. And in the lower left corner, you can see a picture of a braided river in New Zealand. But I think of note this picture of how we have to transform both education, but also our career models. And I think this would be a terrific model for us to have in our head. And they note in their paper that the pipeline is really an archaic vision for careers, that in fact, you know, it's important to have a new view that this traditional pipeline model whereby an individual follows a fairly linear, predictable and structured path through K through 12 undergraduate and graduate education into a career-long, you know, government or business or academic position really just doesn't capture the reality of modern STEM careers, nor does it capture, I think, you know, how people change and learn, as Al said, about continuing education over time. And the fact is that also what matters is, you know, interdisciplinary and innovative opportunities in STEM that we have to build into our expectations. And in fact, we need to meet the challenges. So the pipeline model, in fact, you know, has some rigidity to it. It also, you know, visually sort of sends a message that those folks that are not in it are kind of drips on the ground. And that's certainly not the way we want to be teaching people. And so, you know, the sides you see are about mentorship, about support along the way, and openness to other experiences, the importance of both education, but also, you know, informal education, the role of after-school programs, the role of museums, science museums, hand-on experiences, the importance of communication and other disciplines. And so I think that as we think about raising our game in the competitions that Al mentioned earlier, in terms of really making sure that all of our citizens, you know, get education, we've got to support educators, but really we've got to have this different model for careers. And I think I will stop there. Thanks, Catherine, for the slide.
Thank you. And if I didn't mention it before, what we're going to do is just have each of the panelists present for up to 10 minutes of their thoughts, and then we'll continue with the discussion after each of them have a chance to present. So if you haven't already, we'd love to have you provide some questions also for all of you out there that are participating, and we'll get those in the chat and hopefully have time to discuss them. That said, off to Professor Hastings. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to speak from the basis of you know, my experience. I, of course, as was said, currently the department head of the Aeroastro department at MIT. So I certainly have that, but I also thought a lot about some of these issues when I was in the Pentagon, chief scientist of the Air Force, and then I also spent 5 years in Singapore running the MIT operation in Singapore, which I had a lot of dealings with the government, and saw how it was that people, parents particularly, thought about education there. So a number of points. First of all, the statement was made that the U.S. has the best educational system in the world. So I'm going to take somewhat disagree with that. What we have is a very broad education system with a lot of different facets associated with it. It's a very large scale system, but it's extremely broad. So at the higher education level, there are over 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States. And for all the hype in the New York Times about people getting into places like Harvard and Stanford and so on, they represent 1%. 1% of the students that go to college and university in the United States. Half of the colleges and universities in the United States have open admission, to them. So, you just get the wrong picture by looking at the wrong things. What is certainly the case is that the U.S. higher education institutions, some of them are among the very best in the world, and that's what you routinely see in the various rankings that come out. Some of them are among the very best in the world, but it's a very broad system. It's also the case, of course, in the K through 12 system, there are outstanding schools, some among the very best in the world. But we also have schools which are really terrible at producing highly educated students with a world-class education. And I think we have to acknowledge that. The spread is just very large. Since I live in the state of Massachusetts, I can tell you, I've heard people in Massachusetts say that if you just looked at the PISA performance of students in Massachusetts, then it is among the best in the world, which is actually true. The PISA performance of students from Massachusetts competes with people from Singapore and Shanghai and so on and so on. But of course, Massachusetts is one state in the union, so that's not a fair thing to say. Never mind, people here sometimes say it, right? So that's the first thing we need to recognize. Secondly, it is undoubtedly the case, as Diane Sylvain said, that the US has done well in recognizing the benefits of education in the economy, because for many years we invested in basic research and in deep mission-driven research. And lots of good things came out of that. The laser, which was funded by a number of government agencies, but certainly AFOSR says that they were a part of that. GPS, the internet, funded by DARPA, Google, funded by NSF. These all came out of kind of basic work that occurred. And this deep and heavy reliance of basic research has been enormously valuable for the economy. But as was pointed out, the funding, at least as a percentage level, and that has actually been falling in the last several years, because the government has become more short-sighted. And of course, a lot of the funding is coming from industry, which is more driven by shorter-term profits. Now, what's also, of course, happening is that the time with some of those things I cited would have done, which was the 60s and 70s, now it's the case that the total investment in R&D across the world is now much more balanced. The US is investing substantial amounts, but so is Europe and so is Asia. That was inevitable. The situation where the US was a dominant player was never going to last. What the NSB Science and Engineering Indicator shows is that science and engineering is now a global enterprise. That was inevitable, and we have to acknowledge that and recognize implications of that. It means that there are smart and capable people around the world learning science and engineering and doing great things, and by collaborating appropriately, we can gain the benefit of that. And, the information flow will occur in multiple ways. I think we just need to acknowledge the times of yore in that sense are gone. Now, what has also happened over the years, of course, is that the US attracted the best and brightest to come to the United States because of the quality of some of the higher education institutions and the freedom to innovate. And many of those people stayed in the US, became US citizens, and the United States was the better for it. So you see that in the data upon how many people, innovators, start companies come from outside the United States. You see it, the data about how many Nobel Prizes go to people who came from outside the United States, who are now citizens here. So that has been enormously beneficial for the United States and needs to continue happening. Now, one of the things that occurred over the last several years is the climate for students became distinctly more chilly. And you see, now some internationals saying they don't feel welcome to come here. And of course, in some other countries, the situation is much more competitive now. So there really is much more competition to attract those people. I think the United States needs to go back to being sure that it attracts the best and brightest here. Of course, the United States also needs to invest in its own population, perhaps because of all the people that were coming. The United States underinvested in its population, but we can't do that any longer. It has to be the case that in the STEM areas, that all the people who have historically not participated feel free to participate in a way that's completely free of bias and is made to be attractive. So, and there's been lots of programs that have tried to do that, to attract more women and underrepresented groups into the STEM areas, so that the US can stay competitive, because this is happening in other parts of the world. Let me also say that I think over the years, there's been a distinct change in tenor. This is looking over 50 years now. We clearly benefited from a time when people went into the STEM areas in the 60s, in part because of big government programs, of course, but also the culture supported that. And even though, STEM was seen as hard, it was exciting and great to do and could be fun, and people went into it. I certainly struggled myself through learning physics and math and chemistry those periods of time, but I'm much better for it. In China now, what you see, as was mentioned, is that there are many students studying in the STEM areas. They have a lot more people going into these areas, but here in the US, the percentage of people going into the STEM areas is, as a percentage of the total going to university, is not that large, and they're often seen as hard, and many schools offer much easier alternatives. I personally think STEM can be hard, but it can also be a lot of fun. And we should be encouraging students to do the hard, fun things to do. Now, as I mentioned, I lived for 5 years in Singapore running the MIT operation there. And what I saw was just, lots of parents investing in their kids for the longer term, to get them to take high quality, rigorous educational things, in part because they would say, Singapore is a country with no natural resources, and the education is the only way they're going to stay competitive. They know that, they recognize that, and they invest in their kids. And you see it in how well Singapore has actually done as a country. Those kind of attitudes are the kind of attitudes I think we need to inculcate, here. Finally, let me make another comment, which was, if you look on the 100-year timescale, there was clearly a time when the quality of the US educational systems for K through 12 went up. And people can debate when it started to turn around. Some people argue it was in the 70s. But what I would suggest is that the last few years has shown that the lack of critical thinking, lack of respect for absolute truth, lack of understanding of science and how science operates and what it needs, and just sheer nonsense coming out of some of the people who are leaders in the country. And that speaks volumes about the failures of the educational system broadly. I could tell you in Singapore, some of the nonsense you hear out of our political leaders, just wouldn't be tolerated because they don't believe that kind of stuff. I think the educational system here needs to get back to helping people to think critically about what is the nature of what's true and what's not true. And quite broadly, I'm talking about an educated population there now. And of course, investing in the STEM area certainly helps you to do that. So with that, let me end my comments and then turn it back actually to our chair.
Thank you, Professor Hastings. So next, we're going to turn it over to Ms. Joy Schanenberger, please.
Great. Hey, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Al, thanks for having me, as well as the Potomac Institute. Thank you for bringing us all together today, especially for me with such distinguished experts. Following both doctors isn't an easy task, but I'll see what I can do and set Tyler up to succeed here as well. I'm excited to talk about how we tackle some of these things, right? The actual how piece of it. I think a lot of us are in agreement on what needs to change in terms of talent output, but it's a pretty significant root challenge in our country that I don't think we've paid much attention to, specifically in preparing new generations for leadership and continued success. It's not lost on me that I don't have 20 plus years of experience, but I am very excited to be here today because I do believe that it takes diversity and thought when it comes to problem solving, right? Nobody has a monopoly on good ideas, which is a philosophy that I've used as I've built Boone and built other teams and companies, and it's one that I think needs to be taken very seriously. It's interesting. Historically, innovation was driven by the government, but in recent generations, we've obviously seen a significant shift, right? Now a college student can launch a successful company from their dorm room if they can figure out how to fund school. And kids in middle and high school are creating NFTs and investing in crypto, right? And to be clear, like the government is still very much innovating, like very, very much, but now there's an increasingly turn to the private sector and to research institutes for their support. There's been a lot of reasons for that shift, but at the bottom line, there has been a shift and we need to pay attention to that. A lot of our thinking, in my opinion, and certainly our structures and our organizations and the red tape around them haven't kept the pace. And I think that is one root cause that we have to tackle, right? The American dream is continually redefined by each generation. And I believe it's what makes our country so special. But with it marks changes and success and happiness, right? Those things change generation over to generation, depending on what's going on in the world. Values and norms shift as well. And, I think we have to be prepared to have frank conversations to ensure that we as a society and as a country are prepared to support the changes and adapt, right? Adapt and overcome at all odds is the famous military phrase. It's not just a nice to have, it's a must have. But yeah, when you look at, in particular, the defense acquisition world, right, we've got a lot of investment in processes and policies and procedures. And the people are an afterthought. If any of you have seen the movie Pentagon Wars on Netflix, that is a perfect metaphor for people being thought of as afterwards, right? Essentially, somebody wanted a pen and they got a laser beam tank, right? Because they were involved in the process. So there's a lot that has changed between generations, baby boomers to millennials in particular, which I'm right on the cusp of the millennial cutoff. I challenge you to find a more dramatic shift between generations. If you look at it, everything, those are probably the two furthest apart, not in combat, but a very dramatic shift in what has happened in our world. At the same time, hiring practices are still linear career paths in education are not linear anymore, right? Before we were building people to support jobs and career paths of 20 to 30 years, and that's just not the case. I believe my journey and my experiences in particular, seeking education, building multiple companies, and making room at the table for myself and others is more reflective of the current generation of a younger Americans' experience, right? So I was raised by a single mom outside of Detroit, and I went to public school. That should tell you a lot, right? I was also a bartender for many years, trying to put myself through school. That should tell you even more about how I learned and where I was, where I was going. I quite literally had to create my own college experience because I didn't have what would be considered the traditional path, right? And I absolutely bombed the ACT. Now it all worked out for me. This isn't self-deprecation, okay? I ended up getting jobs at the White House and the Pentagon supporting the highest levels of government, but it was because I could architect a learning environment for myself that wasn't dependent upon scores, because I could build trust and then build my capability, right? At the time, I personally didn't know what I wanted to do. I had ideas. Some were obviously better than others. My mom would tell you that. But I didn't know about all the opportunities that were even available to me. And realistically, there's jobs today that didn't exist back then. So how do we prepare for a future where we may not even know what jobs we're going to need, right? I believe that we need to be willing to have those frank conversations, which is why I'm excited to be here today, and to understand and accept that we're going to need to try and fail new and big ideas, and that everything should be on the table for discussion. I especially believe that we need to shift away from standardized testing and instead prioritize aptitude testing. Aptitude is the ability to learn something new at various stages of education and career, back to what Al was saying about the professionalism of the acquisition workforce, for example. See, there's a lack in critical thinking in today's education, and the byproduct is a lack in curiosity of our whole, U.S. society, and that has a direct impact on what type of leaders are created and the ability that they have to deliver. So when we teach to a test, right, students aren't learning that they're memorizing. This is not new. I believe we need to better identify the aptitudes and the abilities of people, right, to create better leaders. And that's something that I'm very proud of that Boone has been able to do and push people forward, is test and develop on aptitude. I know my fellow panelists will have terrific insight, and they already have, on the academic innovation side, and it absolutely does exist. I look forward to sharing a little bit more about what we've learned through developing our talent engine that trains for aptitude and upskills talent in a digital workforce, because it's not only possible, it works today. Just like my hometown ended up upskilling an entire industry to move from automobile production to war production during World War II. I believe today, the people in this room and in our country, we have the grit, we have the brains, and we have the tenacity to help solve the talent crisis in our country. And I think everybody does have a leading role. Kind of final thoughts, Al, you talked about biggest risk and biggest opportunities. From my perspective, the biggest risk, as Dr. Falcone pointed out, is the fact that the brain is a muscle. And if we don't exercise it, and that we're not intentional about building a country that is a learning organization, the biggest risk is that we have significant atrophy in our most important muscle. We can't count on the government to solve that for us by a future bailout or more investment, because economically our debt is way too high, and student debt is a whole other issue. So we have to be intentional about exercising that muscle so there's not atrophy. That's what I think the biggest risk is. What we need to produce has changed, right? The talent, the output that we need at the pace we need it, but we haven't changed the how, we haven't changed the structure. And if we don't do that, I think we run a huge risk there. In terms of biggest opportunities, I think we have the ability to apply some intelligent design to treat the United States as a learning organization, regardless of what badge you're wearing, government, industry, academic. The way that I would do that is tackling a defense civilian training corps. Very, very young, from ROTC all the way up through, especially for folks that maybe don't qualify for military service but want to serve in shorter stints. The second opportunity that I would take advantage of is there's a lot of 9/11 vets who are getting out. They've been produced by the greatest, leading organization in the world, in my opinion. The U.S. military creates some of the best and brightest leaders. And if you tackle that body and upskill and train for technical jobs, right? Test them for their aptitude to learn something new, versus them going to pay 6 figures at, getting an MBA and then getting tagged as a BD person at some random defense company. I think there's a huge missed opportunity to upskill for technical jobs in that arena. And then last but not least, I think that the entrepreneur community should be treated actually as a hard science and not just a soft skill for our country, because our country was built by entrepreneurs, whether they were Americans or not. That's fundamental to the fabric of who we are, and I think it is dismissed as a soft skill until we really need it. And with that, I'll turn it over back to you.
Thanks, Joy. There's a lot of great stuff to unpack there. I'm looking very much forward to tackling some of those comments. Thank you. And Trevor, you have the floor, sir.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm humbled to be invited to be a part of this panel. As many of you know in the room, I am fairly young and don't have a whole lot of experience. But I think as a 20-something, maybe some of what I say will have some pertinence. A lot of the things that the panelists have said so far were things that I was maybe wanting to say. So rather than reiterate many of the points, I might just kind of reflect on some of the things that have been said already. So I think what Dr. Falcone said about investing in our children, I think is absolutely foundational, is something that is, I think, lacking today. I don't think I will be surprising anyone when I say that educational success correlates very strongly with a number of social factors or economic factors, what have you, and I think that those are distributed fairly unevenly, or they are in fact distributed fairly unevenly around our country, and I think that Joy could attest to that. As she said, she based on where she grew up. I also think that cost of education is something that is clearly impeding upon students of all varieties, maybe even attempting to try something harder. So it is, I think, just a point of fact that most students, regardless of their scholarship status or their background, can't really afford to try and fail at the hard things in higher education specifically. I know that I barely made it through 4 years of university, and that was not for want of trying to do the hard things. I also think that when it comes to the people who are academically gifted enough and have the time and the aptitude, as we've discussed, to even kind of contribute to something like defense or the future of technology and science, I think that, and I do have a lot of faith in the power of incentives. Today, and especially in the American economy, the incentives are not driven towards what can I do for my country. It's driven towards how can I extract the greatest value from my degree so that myself and those around me can either live a little more easily or just have a nicer life. To steal a line from Senator Ed Markey's campaign, I think the time of what can I do for my country is much more shifting, I think, culturally to what can my country do for me. And I think that it's been a bit of a one-way street in the last several decades, and maybe a two-way street relationship should kind of reemerge as a foundational relationship between citizen and government. And then I guess as a critique of a policy issue, so I think that, and I'm not perfectly familiar with the legalistic nature of this, but at least where I'm from, and I'm from Connecticut, which has a great public school system, I must say. I felt very prepared. It's a lot like Massachusetts, Dr. Hastings. But our public schools are funded by property values, largely, and the property taxes derived from those values. And both positively and negatively, it's a feedback loop. So if your municipality has high property values, it derives more property taxes, which they can then go into funding better schools, which raises the property value, and vice versa, negatively. So there's a lot of upward and downward pressure on the way that we fund our schools, and therefore the quality of the education that those students can receive. Speaking about universities, I think, to get back to that, I think one of the things that is really difficult, and speaking about the pipeline of education, I as a recent graduate, and so I went to Santa Clara University, which is in the heart of Silicon Valley. So they pride themselves on producing a lot of world-class engineers in computer science and computer engineering, but also mechanical engineering. The institution of weed out courses, I think, is still very strong, and the pedigree of having a STEM degree forces a lot of students out of that pipeline. And I think that what Dr. Falcone mentioned about the braided river approach, I think was very interesting, and I would like to hear more about it, because I think especially students of my ilk would have loved that kind of experience at university, rather than having to say, what can I actually succeed at off the bat? What do I know that I'm good at? Rather than giving something a shot at a fantastic university. With that, I will stop. I think I might catch myself rambling here. So thank you very much for having me, and it's an honor. Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thanks, Trevor. Let me go ahead and just try to hit a couple of themes and then see if we have any questions. As I sat back and listened, there were some themes that came out across multiple speakers. The first is that we need to continue to evolve the model from what it was. Be that, Pat, your discussion about the braided river, Joy, your discussion about having to go through college in a different path. My trajectory, had I not entered ROTC, I was working 30 hours a week to put myself through school. ROTC let me take the courses I wanted to, but I think we do need to continue to evolve the model. And I will say very briefly, I didn't talk about him earlier, one of my personal heroes for what he has done for STEM in America is Professor Freeman Hrabowski, who's retiring from UMBC here later this year. But another theme was we need to have more people that look like America, vice what we currently have in STEM. Dr. Hrabowski basically said, I'm going to bring kids in from inner cities, underrepresented areas, but we're going to get them the basic education that they need to then begin to go into science and engineering courses. And if it took the kids 6 years to get through, or 7 years, no big deal, because the university was committing to them. His success rate is remarkable. The second theme, and this popped up in some of the discussions, Joy, I think you said it most articulately, but I will also mention it's come up in other of these seminars, a generational change. And people don't all have the same American dream. And until we can all establish a common, at least, basis for an American dream, we're going to have a hard time moving forward as a nation. I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think we have to respect and understand that different people see the world differently. The third theme that came out, and I really like this statement, the brain is a muscle, and STEM is hard and fun. And those two things kind of go together. But it also goes back to the model. And Trevor, some of what you were talking, I remember as an undergrad, a lot of people went to the University of Vermont because it had a great medical school. So second semester, sophomore year, they would take organic chemistry, and about 90% of the people would fail. And they would get discouraged away from science because they weren't going to be a doctor. What a stupid way to teach people how to go to universities. Purposefully have courses where you want to flunk out most of the people because you want to have your medical school pristine. And then the fourth theme that came out, I think, across everybody, was we need to invest more heavily in children. And I think that's important for America. So I think about, and I am not one who likes a lot of additional government spending. America is living beyond its means. But we really have to look at, especially in this area, are we giving tools to our youngest people so that they can become educated? At the start of the pandemic, I saw a figure that suggested up to 40% of school children in Baltimore did not have access to broadband. How the hell are you going to do virtual learning if you don't have access to the internet and broadband? We threw away 40% of the kids in Baltimore. That's not where we need to be as a nation. So again, all of these things kind of come together. And I want to thank the people for, I have all kinds of notes, but those four themes to me emerged amongst others. I don't know if anybody else had a theme that emerged, and I'd love to hear it. But I also understand, Catherine, we do have questions. So why don't we get questions from people who are investing their time to listen to us?
So I have some of those questions here to share, and one of these questions actually came up, and I think it was Professor Hastings that touched on this. And the question is, could you address the role of critical thinking education in this age of fake news and alternative facts? Can you expand a little more on that, Professor Hastings, or anyone that wants to from the panel to that end?
I'll let Dan go first, but I certainly have those things. I have opinions.
And I think Trevor's interested in answering that too.
Well, I would say that people who know how to think critically would know how to formulate, let's call it, logical hypotheses, understand how they can go from where they are to some other set of logical statements that follow, understand about which things support or do not support the statements, and then come to conclusions that actually make sense on the basis of the evidence they have, as well as understand where the uncertainties actually are in their arguments, and then treat them with the appropriate level of respect. I mean, there's many things that go into that kind of critical thinking. Certainly, in order to do STEM areas, you have to be able to do all of those things. You have to be able to do all of those steps. But there's many areas outside of STEM where you have to do that too. And anybody who studies history will realize you need to do the same kind of thing as well, or even languages or something else like that. It's just a way of thinking broadly about how the world is actually organized, that we need to make sure that people understand, right?
So regarding that, I think that to answer the question, children and young people these days, and adults I think as much, are probably flooded with media of all varieties more than ever before, and media literacy is not a subject taught. So, and frankly, I didn't hear the word epistemology until I was an upperclassman in university, and the teaching of knowing why you know something and how you know something, I think, is foundational to the critical thinking as an area of learning. So you can be as gifted or talented or educated in STEM as you can be, but you can still be a rube. And so being able to not have the wool pulled over your eyes by a talented rhetorician is I think just as important, I think, in preparing our young people for the future.
Trevor hits on something that we actually discussed at our last event. Was the focus of it was the proliferation, really, of information and how it's conveyed. And Joy hit on this a little bit too, with regard to how we have these smartphones, right, and these iPads and what have you, tablets, and you could essentially filter your information, how you bring it in, how you and then how you use it without, and if you don't have those critical thinking skills, and I think this is what Trevor's getting at here, how do you use that information, and where is it coming from, and not being critical about it really can impact your advantage or disadvantage in that regard to that end. So
I would be curious. We have some of the Potomac Institute staff here. When you see something, and these are all younger than I am, when you see something online or social media, how often do you do a fact check? And how do you do a fact check? I mean, I go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I go to OECD, I go to the Stockholm Institute for Peace, looking at the actual numbers. It's amazing how many people do not do that. And that actually is, I think, a very good theme here, is being able to critically think. How many of you guys do fact checking? Excellent, good.
Lots of hands up in the audience here. Was there anyone else on the panel that wanted to weigh in on this before we moved on to the next question?
I would just say that what Al said was a little bit what I was thinking, in that I just think people have to take data, right? I mean, so that's both facts that one can find of things that you can count, but I think it gets to Joy's point about what exactly is the American dream, what exactly are, what leads to the kind of life that you want. I think you have to, imagine something, test it, talk to people. And so I think that's kind of part of critical thinking for everyday decisions. Take data, try coffee one place and try it someplace else. Don't just go for reputations. And I'll say that, and I don't even drink coffee, but that seems to be a thing. So taking data, I think, is an important part of critical thinking.
So building on that thought, the theme that Al was mentioning about that American dream, I'm going to ask Joy this question. She mentioned values and norms shifting over time, and we adapt. So what do you think? And something that we've talked about during several of our events is what are those core things that bring us together, that we define us as Americans, that transcend generations, really. Mm-hmm. So what? Joy, can I ask you what are some of those things? What are some of the things that do hold us together? Yes, we adapt over time. Our values and norms shift over time, but what are some of those underlying things? Because that, again, has proven to be an advantage for us as a country, is certain values that I think we share, and then translate into the way we go about life, right? And that translates to our economy and our education system and such. So
the short answer is I don't know the answer. But I'll tell you a couple of things that come to mind that I jotted down as other folks were chatting. I think it's really easy for our country to forget who we are and where we came from. Very, very easy, especially because information changes. The news cycles, they're not even 24 hours now. They're like 2-minute news cycles, like literally, right? So I think it's really easy for us to forget where we came from. And what I mean by that is we built our country with amazing collaboration across a massive diversity of people, right? And we didn't just create a country and founding fathers and just, create this architecture that we could evolve within, but still respect from a morals and values standpoint of what we stood for. But we also created markets, industries, technologies, new ways of fighting, new ways of peacekeeping, all these things, where America became on the global stage. And people forget that. And I think the further and further we come, away from that time period, if the way that we learn and teach and involve folks in that story, that it's not just a given, it's almost like this, well, somebody's going to solve it because I'm an American, right? Forgetting that, like, oh, hey, it's actually my duty to help solve and push it forward. So I think that our country actually needs a branding strategy, says the marketer, right? Because, the pursuit, life, liberty, and the pursuit of the American dream isn't enough anymore. And if I liken it to entrepreneurs who have failed in scaling an organization or failed in creating something that lasted without them, I jotted down, companies that have a poor culture, what happens is a founder says, why aren't my people selling? Why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they doing that? Like, they should be on my journey. They should have my vision and carry this out and be proud and talk about it and bring more value. But if your community isn't proud of what you're building because they don't know the goal, there's no way that they can do that, right? They can't be proud to pursue that. Where you see other companies that, you see like people immediately be proud, like, oh, I got a job at X and look at all this cool stuff, and they're furthering it and they're talking about it because they know the goal and they believe in the dream and the vision, and they know at least one part of how they fit into that. But back to the, what my country can do for me piece, that's very real. And I think the systemic issue in that is really the student debt crisis, because it's how much can I get out of my degree? And I do think student debt is a national security issue.
Tim, if I can interrupt and make some comments back to what Joy said, as well as a premise that came out as a theme from Al Shaffer's comments of we all need to be on the same path for an American dream. And I want to twist that a little bit rather than talking about American dream, but say that we all need to be on the same path from a branding strategy, as Joy had mentioned, or a strategic communications of how we go and talk about ourselves, not just in necessarily a 5-year plan or the 4-year plan from any administration, but in a 20 and 30-year plan of where our 100-year plan of where we're going to be as a country. And with the American dream maybe altering generation to generation, I think it's really all still foundationally the same. We are a vast, very diverse group of people that all have dreams with a country in the land of opportunity that we can all reach those dreams, right? So it's the land of opportunity that I don't think has shifted generation to generation, and we certainly don't want to lose looking forward. So I just wanted to alter that a little bit and argue with the premise of we all need to have the same vision of the future where yes but no.
Well, no, so yeah, if I gave the impression we all have to have the same vision of the future, I did not intend to. We do have to have a common, in my opinion, a common set of values. Joy, I'm glad, I'm ecstatic that you are quoting President Kennedy, because I think that was one of the things that I remember, first things I remember as a kid. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I think we've lost some of that. I think we've lost a lot of that. I also will say that a lot of the things that I believed in, this country was a land where everybody could achieve. I'm not sure young people believe that anymore. I've had some young people challenge that because they don't believe that to be true. That shakes me to my core because, and Joy, I like your story. I grew up in what would be considered the French-Canadian ghetto in Burlington, Vermont. Not much of a ghetto, but when I went to school, kindergarten, 3/4 of the kids did not speak English. They spoke French. And I grew up on a street where we had a couple people who went to prison for life for murder. But I was able to, the country gave so much to me to let me achieve. I don't know that young people see that as broadly anymore, and that concerns me. And it concerns me a lot when we think about some of the disadvantaged groups that no longer believe that, because that will tear at our basic fabric and will make us be uncompetitive. I have used this phrase a lot. A country that is at war with itself can't be competitive internationally. And we have to figure out a way to get to there, and that theme of common shared values, I think, is very important. It's not really an education issue, but it is an education issue.
So can I ask, actually, to that end, Professor Hastings brought up a point about foreign students not necessarily feeling welcome in the university. So how do we reconcile what we're talking about here about shared values as Americans with what you talked about, Professor Hastings? Do you have any thoughts on that? Based on what are the things that we could do to make them feel welcome and part of what's going on here, and a part of the ingenuity and the entrepreneurialism and such that have made this country great, and the immigrants population that was built on in many ways. From your perspective, what are some of the things that we can leverage to help us with our competitive advantage moving forward?
Well, my comments were relative to the last several years, where we, even before COVID, there was a sense that the United States was just not as welcoming to those students, and you saw a whole bunch of rules go into effect that affected that. I mean, frankly, I would say go back to before that. the people who come to colleges and universities, I would argue we want them to stay. As simple as that.
If I can amplify on that a little bit, I have seen figures lately that suggest that the number of immigrants that we are letting into our country, even for student visas, is about a third of what it was a decade ago. We have dramatically reduced the number and the opportunity for people to come. We've also had a pretty horrific rhetoric against immigrants. And I think that's hurting our competitive nature. I think one of the great programs in the United States was if people came to this country, enlisted in the military, they could fast track their way to citizenship. And I know in my command, my 06 level command, I had people from about 15 different countries. And they wanted to buy into whatever the American dream is, but they wanted to buy into it. And now we are cutting off that opportunity, and that will make us less competitive, in my opinion. By the way, most of those kids, they do their military thing, get their degree, and then use their GI Bill to go out and get educated.
So if I might shift a little bit over to Dr. Falcone on something that you brought up about collaborating with Silicon Valley, and actually came up a couple times in the conversation. What do you feel that in your collaboration with the private sector, with the technology companies and the businesses you're working with, are they feeling the necessity to think about our competitive advantage, our role in the world with regard to the work that we're doing overall? I think in those terms.
Well, I guess I don't know that I'm the best person to say what they're thinking, but I will say that I think that there are many technical domains in which neither the U.S. nor, and in particular, the U.S. government doesn't really own the technical edge. And they are technical domains in which there's a great amount of invention, discovery, innovation. And so I think, broad information technology, including, software and hardware and new approaches, and so quantum computing comes in there, big machines, heterogeneous computing, linkage of artificial intelligence with physical simulation, harnessing big data sets. So that's a big area where we know that the global private sector is doing well. Bio is another area, and I guess I would also include cyber, because of course that sort of gets to hardware and software systems. So when you think about those areas, and space and aeronautics used to be totally military, it of course isn't now. So for the government to capture the froth, the government can't sit on the side. So we have to have a model in which we are good enough to be a part of the froth in particular areas where we know it matters to government decision making, or we know it matters because we have some understanding of national security situations where we would like to understand what's possible, what isn't possible. And to do that, we have to have new mechanisms for making those partnerships, because the government has had the view that they're big and heavy and they put a lot of money in, and therefore they could dictate all the terms of the relationships. And, that just doesn't work when in fact the government is trying to learn. So I think we have to, one, be sure that we have folks that are good enough that both understand the national security implications, but they're good enough technically in some aspect that it's worth the private sector. They want to get some of that. I think it's important for us not to have AI algorithms, data sets, things like that, all in the private sector. We need to have public sector experts. And I think to do that, so I think there's interest. I think we're successful, but then we also have to remake our processes. We've got to make it easier to maybe have a reserve corps of technical people, say from the military or these folks that Al just talked about that have gotten their education, did military, but now they've got a technical education and they want to go into the private sector. But what if we had technical reserve, right, where we kept their clearances, they could be the core of a response. So that would be a different idea. But also we just have to have mechanisms. I'll say there's so partnerships is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, is how do we lean forward? So one of the ways that we usually do partnerships is through something called a cooperative research and development agreement. That's great. Since Bayh-Dole, we've really been able to get a lot of government investments into the private sector, make jobs, support companies, but it's a one-to-one partnership. So if you really want to build a team of diverse organizations, you end up with multiple one-to-one arrangements. So what we'd like is to be able to have some different ideas. So one partnership that we've had for some time now, maybe 5 years, that includes a university, a biotech firm, 2 laboratories in the government from different cabinet agencies. And then now multiple labs. We have all these point-to-point creatives that don't make any sense. I mean, because they're too, just to sign a non-disclosure agreement to talk to another potential partner, we have to have every team's legal look at it. So we're trying to transition that to a 501c3 entity, a public good entity. And so it's pushing the edges of how we partner with the private sector. So I think we do have interest, but we have to be sure that we have an openness to innovation in partnering approaches. And we have to try some things that are a little different than what we've done before, particularly in these areas. And I do think there's enough. I don't know what all the private sector people are thinking, but we have a lot of great citizens in our private sector companies that have been invented here. So I think there's no dearth of good partners. I'm just not positive about all of them.
As we've gone through this, I would like to see if I can formulate a question that I would like to get the thoughts of the other panelists. And I want to try to state it fairly simply. One thing that has not come up much is the use of expanding the use of interns. Yet I think experiential learning is so much more valuable than, I think back to my undergrad days and taking partial differential equations and spending the first 2 weeks solving Bessel functions, which I never looked at again in my life. So I learned all this stuff that I never used. It would have been much more valuable to have some coursework out with, and then some work out with technical folks. Do we think that that's a viable model? And is it an important enough model to think about from a policy perspective, giving people tax credits for those types of programs? So instead of direct government investment, give industry tax credits to develop internships that have technical merit around universities. Does that make any sense?
I think it's a good idea. I'd broaden it, Al, to include giving different cabinet agencies responsibility for workforce engagement, because as you know, we've gone back and forth a little bit about whose job it is to be engaged in supporting, the full education and training of folks. And so it sort of expands and contracts. And I think an expansive model is needed so that, for example, agencies all have, and I, for example, I'm very familiar with the Department of Energy, which really doesn't have the same authorities as somebody like NASA, where it's in their founding legislation that they should engage with the community, that they should talk about the excitement of their results, that they should develop coursework, they should have interns. We do training, and but we don't have exactly the same authority, and occasionally, DOE will get hit over the head saying, "Oh no, only NSF can do these things." in advanced science and technology. So I do think we need to, again, it's this idea of opening the aperture, because we need everything, particularly that's regionally distributed, right? It's where we are, we certainly are adjacent to areas that are not well served. We're located near the Central Valley, which is a part of California, way south in the Inland Empire, further north, where it's not, the state of Washington is similar as well. You've got pockets of great support and jobs and too much traffic, but you have big pockets where you don't have the education, you don't have the openness to internships, you can't drive. I think the other thing we need is some different models for internships. So particularly as we think about place-based innovation and community engaged research, which is something that some of the USICA bills and the America Competes bills have been talking about. Not everybody's in driving range or can move to do these internships. The students can't. So I think we've got to think about now taking advantage of these virtual approaches, so that maybe we backstop through an internship teachers in more rural areas. And then instead of an internship, we imagine a whole class then coming to some place where they have to travel a little bit and spend a week or a weekend getting that hands-on experience. So that's a little broader idea of, so yes to your internship point, and then just a plus of let's be broader about what does it mean to have an internship and how do we make it realistic for folks, that don't have cars and they're at a rural school and maybe their teachers aren't, expert on things. We have a program now where we're working on curriculum of using smartphones to teach actually the physics, high school physics, the experiments, not just the problem solving across the web, but that we can do that to actually with some accessories, right? But you've got accelerometers, you can teach this, and we've been working on curriculum that's consistent with the next generation science, and that's just really, people have tried that, but I think we've got to change the models a little bit.
Can you teach me how to use my smartphone? I'm just...
Well, let me just add, I think it's a very good idea. So you mentioned the experience of the weed out course in chemistry at the University of Vermont. What many studies have shown is that when people drop out of engineering, in the first and second year, they do it because they don't understand what the relationship is between what they're learning and doing something in engineering. And the way most engineering curricula are structured, they don't actually see that until the fourth year. So that's why they don't understand. They don't understand why they're learning all this, trying to learn all this math and physics. And so internships, insofar as they connect people to reality, are very valuable. If they can see, this is why these Bessel functions actually do have a use. If you want to understand apertures, diffraction of an aperture, you need to use Bessel functions, right? Then okay, then it's valuable.
Very good.
Yeah, the only other thing that I think, Al, your part of your beginning question was would tax credits work, right, for internships, if I heard that correctly. If you look at different programs where, like the state of Michigan did this, for example, where they offered companies tax credits to move their headquarters there, there's a precedent saying it works because you're creating jobs. But the next jump to Pat's point is, how do you open that aperture and actually measure success, not on here's a tax credit for creating a job, but here's a tax credit for investing in experience, and you can actually measure the upskilled, talent. That's the next part. So it's like job is one number, it's one metric. It's not the only metric that exists. It's the quality in that person, I think, is the piece that we're missing, and there's probably a way to solve for that.
Oh, you're going to solve for that, Joy. I already know that.
So this actually brings up a point too that how this how China has approached this how they're dealing with the world as a whole society, and we're still trying to figure that out, struggle with it, right? And this is a means by which inside our values, right, our culture, our construct, the way things are, we can approach that more societal kind of level approach to how we gain those advantages, given where we've been, given what our economy looks like, open markets and such. And Dr. Falcone mentioned USICA. That's a means by a possible policy means by to help accelerate that. So, Trevor, did you want to mention it? Would you have been one of those interns? Would you have taken one of those internships if it was offered? I like the idea that, especially if I would have been able to link the organic chemistry that I had to take and suffer through to the real world, I think it would have helped a lot.
Right. Well, at least in my experience, the expectation of an internship is that it translates into employment in many ways, especially at my university, and naturally that makes them extremely competitive, and scarce. And if you have 1,500 kids that all want the same internship and there's only 3 positions there, and when you don't get it, you're discouraged, or you put all your eggs in one basket. So obviously, if it was there for the taking, I think anyone would take it. But it's a matter of the resources that are made available to engage students in those kinds of activities. So if they were subsidized in any way, some of them are unpaid, some of them are, you're mandated to pay interns in many places. But for some reason, the reciprocation of people that want to do it versus people that are allowed to do it is imbalanced, which I think is a shame, because I think most people are eminently qualified for all kinds of positions, but they're scarce for whatever reason.
So changing the incentive structure, maybe like you were talking about,
absolutely.
is
Absolutely,
probably,
yeah.
core to that. So we do have one more question, I think, from the audience. Mr. Tim or Dr. Tim Bumpus had a question, I think, that he wanted to pose.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on what Dr. Hastings mentioned about the priority that's placed on education in Singapore. It seems to me that while we talked briefly about the difficulties in defining the American dream or American priority structures, the pandemic has pretty clearly illustrated that education is not an American priority. We have kept schools closed when we've opened bars and restaurants, despite the very clear public health data about the relative risks of those two activities. So what are actionable steps that we can take to reframe priorities around education in this country so that this really important discussion that we're having today actually can play out on a field where it has some chance of success, instead of us all just screaming into the void?
Well, I also, just to add on to Tim's point here, is that Dr. Hastings said that Singapore places such an emphasis on education because it lacks natural resources of any meaningful variety, which is interesting because in America, as Tim mentioned, maybe it's not seen as a huge priority here, but 80% of our workforce is utterly disconnected from natural resources of any kind. So it's an interesting disconnect in juxtaposition compared to Singapore. So thanks for bringing it up, Tim.
This is a very hard question. Yes, you had to reframe the American experience, right? No, I have to agree that the events of the last year or so would indicate that we don't place a priority in education. I'd accept that position, right? Now, I think I have a number of thoughts about this. So the first, of course, is that one of the things that I think actually has not been that helpful in this country is framing education entirely around around jobs. I mean, that was not the Jeffersonian position on education. It was about an educated individual, educated citizen, you know. And in a sense, the trouble about framing around jobs is just as Dr. Falcone said, you know, whatever the jobs are today, we don't know what the jobs of 10 years from now are going to be like. Right? It's much more important to frame education around a way that helps people to continue to learn and to be flexible and to grow. I mean, those are the people who are going to do well in 10 years and 15 years from now. So I'd have to think about it. I'm not entirely sure how to answer the question, but maybe my other panelists can do that.
Well, I think that really pitches to what Joy was talking about earlier with regard to, as you know, what are your aptitudes, you know, and how do you adjust and learn based on what those aptitudes are, so you can make your way in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always going to be a need for very traditional career paths for folks that do want to be practitioners for 20 and 30 years, doctors, lawyers. Like, I mean, there's still curiosity, you know, and you can jump around within there. But for the most part, you're, you know, as Al was saying, upskilling every year to stay relevant. But I think the majority of the workforce does need to, it has to be on the education side of actually teaching curiosity and being okay to adapt, because information and, you know, science and technology move too fast now, period. And so if you don't exercise, you know, that muscle to do that same thing, you will forever fail. You'll just be paralyzed and, you know, not know what to do. You know, interestingly enough, so kind of two relevant quick stories that I think point to this being possible. My great grandmother, her name was Alberta Boone. I named the company after her. She's basically like the real life Rosie the Riveter, right? She's amazing, love her. She helped raise me with my single mom, and during World War II, she, you know, founded a restaurant. Built it pretty large to the point where she was feeding 40,000 auto workers, right? So think of it like a food production line. And the government came to her to acquire her location because they needed it to produce munitions. And she made the point that, hey, if I'm producing food for 40,000 people on time every day, I can melt metal. And I have the ability to upskill all of my workers to do it, because I know you have a labor shortage because all the men are at war. So she did it, right? But she did it because she grew up, you know, poor, gritty. So that muscle in her brain was already developed to be able to say, okay, well, this is changing. So how do I adapt so I can maintain a business? And I don't think that our educational structure really teaches that yet. I think it comes naturally to some people, like entrepreneurs, right? But as Dr. Falcone was saying, like, don't accept I'm bad at math. Like, you have to actually teach that function. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of how I know aptitude works. To date, we have successfully upskilled over 15,000 U.S. veterans and military spouses for free in technical jobs. And we attack that by looking at the mechanics of their experience and realize that the root cause of underemployment, unemployment, and in really, really tough cases, suicide, was not as heavily weighted on PTSD as some of the data says. It was the inability to make the jump from, I was a career infantry guy or gal blowing up front doors for a living for 30 years. How would I ever be happy being a cyber threat hunter behind a desk? Physically, that's a really hard jump to make, right? It's like you're a professional baseball player, and then it's, you know, hey, you're going to be happy ice skating. What? Like that, those things are just opposed. So what's interesting is that if you test for aptitude and you train and you align and you have more immersive learning to show that not only are you going to be happy or fulfilled, but you can do the job, and here's the skills you need to succeed, and then there's a professional pathway to rotate you, you know, up and out. I would love to see that at scale in our country, because I think it would solve for a lot. But that's clearly a passion project, as you can probably hear in my voice. So
I'm going to go into a flashback. I had forgotten about the aptitude test that you take going into the Air Force, and I think most services. It was not like your normal SAT type test where you did equations. It was more like, suppose you're flying upside down and you have to pull a stick this direction. Which direction is the plane going to go? And some people get that and some don't. But we were actually doing aptitude testing 50 years ago, right? And we never talk in that terminology really anymore. And we don't do that in schools. So that's actually an interesting idea. And I also wonder if there's a physiological thing that could be done with it also. Is the way some people's brains are wired better for thing X than Y? I don't know. It's a good idea.
How much of that's in genetics?
If I may, regarding aptitude testing, I believe Germany does a fair amount of it, just as a matter of course after they finish like primary school, and it's fairly un-American in essence because it basically says if you do so well on it, you can go to college, and if you don't do so well on it, don't bother. And so a lot of them end up going into trades fairly early on because they've been told by the government in the aptitude test that they're better off doing something like that. Whereas the more cerebral aptitude folks go into higher education. So grappling with the un-Americanness of that style of filtering your society is something that we'd have to grapple with. And I do kind of want to get back to Tim's question. He's no longer with us for whatever reason. But when you ask the question, why doesn't America value education, or it feels that way anyway, you have to talk about values. And so I think someone brought it up earlier, and I think we left it hanging, but I think that some of the most enduring values in American society are the primacy of the individual and competition. And if we're going to try to if we're focusing our efforts on making America competitive, so much of what I think people view what they're getting out of their education is becoming competitive against their fellow Americans. And because of the scarcity of like meaningful jobs or what have you. So kind of getting past that, I think, is going to be foundational to kind of getting ourselves on track to seeing ourselves as Americans moving forward. So yeah.
I see by my watch we have about 5 minutes left. I want to respect people's times. So what I would like to do is see if any of the panelists, or we'll just go around, is there any burning issue that you wish would have come up but did not? And Joyce, since you're the person who's up on the screen first, I'm going to ask you, what do you think we missed?
No, I think this is a very valuable discussion. For me, it's about, so what? What are we going to do about it? So I'm really excited to see the results of the paper, obviously, but I really, really urge the community to not just have us be a one and done, and we have some very great thought, but how does that translate into one actionable initiative, right? So if Dr. Falcone and Dr. Hastings and myself and Trevor each took one thing in our respective corner of the world, that's going to make things a little bit better, right? And same thing with everybody in the audience. For me, it's about the how. We know what the what is. It's change the output, change the result of the talent we're producing in the country. But how do we tackle that, and who owns what? I'm really hungry to execute. So that would be my challenge, is to attack one part of the how.
Excellent. Pat, you want to go next?
I think I'll just echo Joy's bias towards action. I think that's what we need.
I agree. Professor Hastings?
Well, the only thing perhaps I would add is this. Many Americans have a very rosy view of America, which has many good things about it, but and you think that the rest of the world is not somehow catching up. It's very instructive to go travel through airports across the world and compare them to airports you see in New York and in other places like that. It's just really instructive, and you know, it wakes you up to the fact that the world, the rest of the world, at least those parts of the world that people planes travel to, is really catching up, or has caught up with a lot of where America actually is.
I will close it with the thing after, but we'll go to Trevor first.
I was going to say something along the lines of what Dr. Hastings says, where, and I'm not so comfortable speaking poorly about America in the presence of veterans, and thank you all for your service, but I think we have a lot to learn from kind of stepping out of our white tower and looking at the rest of the world and learning what we can from not only the institutions that they've set up, but also the way that they just kind of behave and the things they value as compared to us.
So I will close by saying thank you to everybody. I will also close, Dan, to kind of amplify something you said earlier about having to explain what was going on in America to Singapore. I was in France, in Paris, when we had some of the craziness over the last 5 years. And I was running a NATO office that did all the NATO R&D, so I had good friends in Turkey and Poland and Norway, as well as France and the UK. And trying to explain to them what the hell was going on in America was always very interesting. So I do think we do need, as Americans, to step back, recognize that the rest of the world is doing some very good things, and then how do we allow ourselves to compete in that arena, and not worry about who's in first place and who's in second and who's in third, but are we turning out what we need to for competitiveness and for continuing a good quality of life. And I will close with that and turn it back over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our panel very much for a great discussion today. And I've looked very much forward, as Joy was mentioning, was supported. What's the action? How do we address this moving forward? I think that is very much something that I look forward to working with you moving forward on. Thank you to the staff of Potomac Institute for helping us get through another great event and setting that up. There's a lot of work that goes into this. Again, the panelists, for your time and thoughts today. Please be on the lookout for our next event, tentatively planned for February 24th from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern, focused on adversarial economic activities by rival nations across the spectrum of conflict, and whether or not DoD and more broadly the U.S. and our allies are postured for competitive advantage on that front. So thanks again today for joining us virtually and in person, and again to our distinguished panel, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Good afternoon.
Good.
Thanks all. And there will be a video of this put up on the website.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.